Welcome to the Thorograph method of performance handicapping. In this beginner's video, we will answer the following questions. What are Thorograph performance ratings? How are the ratings calculated and what makes them different from and superior to typical speed ratings? How are Thorograph performance ratings interpreted for handicapping? Why do many well-known horsemen use Thorograph to buy and claim horses and manage their stables? Let's get started with an explanation of what goes into Thorograph performance ratings and how and why they are used. The two most important questions in assessing a race are, first, how well has each horse performed in the past? That is, how fast are they? And second, how well will each horse run today? Thorograph accurately answers the first question by allowing you to objectively compare horses which have run under different conditions at different tracks, at different distances, and on different days. You will know with complete certainty which horse ran better. Horse A, who finished second in a 3-year-old allowance race at 1 1/8 on a muddy track at Aqueduct, or horse B, who ran fourth in a 35,000 claimer for older horses at 7 furlongs on a fast track at Santa Anita. Let's take a look at a Thoro-Graph sheet for the horse Proudest Hour. Each number on this sheet represents a performance rating for one of Proudest Hour's races. The figure has been arrived at by using the time of the race in hundredths of a second and adjusting for beaten lengths using Thorograph's unique formula, the amount of ground that Proudest Hour saved or lost on the turns, the amount of weight he carried, and the effect of wind speed and direction during the running of the race. Our own Thorograph trackmen record these variables and hand time each race. The figure is then adjusted with a finely tuned track variant. All of this information is reduced down to one rating for each race a horse runs. And a horse's Thorograph sheet, such as the one you are looking at, contains our performance rating for every race he has ever run, from 2-year-old to present, placed on the graph in chronological order. Our formulas were refined and have been proven over tens of thousands of races to ensure that the ratings are absolutely consistent from one distance to another. A performance rating of 22, for example, represents exactly the same effort, or performance, at 6 furlongs as does a 22 at 1 1/8. Next, we will go into more specifics about our methodology. Let's look more closely at each factor that goes into a Thorograph rating so you will have confidence in just how accurate these numbers are and an understanding of what they represent. First, time of race in hundredths of a second. This appears to be self-explanatory and rather simple, but it is not, because of something called a run-up. Most people believe that the track teletimer starts when the gate opens, but it doesn't. The teletimer is actually tripped when the first horse out breaks a light beam similar to a burglar alarm that is fixed along the rail at the appropriate distance from the finish line. The problem is that when the driver backs the starting gate into place, he parks it behind the teletimer's beam, and the distance between the gate and the beam is not uniform. It is not unusual for it to range from 15 feet to 150 feet behind the beam. This distance is called the run-up, and it is recorded by the Thorograph trackman for each race. When the run-up is very short, the horses are barely moving when the timer starts because they just don't have the room to accelerate fully. Conversely, when the run-up is longer, the horses are moving at full throttle when the timer starts. This means, for example, you can have 2 races on the same day at the same distance that appear by the track's timer to have identical winning times, but which are actually very different performances. In the case of the shorter run-up, the horses actually perform better because they were moving slower when the timing began. Second, beaten lengths. Once we have the true final time of the race, each horse's rating has to be adjusted for the distance he finished behind the winner. That is obvious. The generally accepted formula for this calculation has always been that 1 length equals 1/5 of a second. But this is only approximately true and does not apply at all if you want performance ratings that can be compared from one distance to another. Suppose that you can run a 100-yard dash in 11 seconds and I can run it in 12 seconds. You would beat me by 1 second. Suppose now that we run 200 yards at the same speed as we ran the 100 yards. You would finish in 22 seconds, 11 times 2, but I would finish in 24 seconds. You would now beat me by 2 seconds, not just 1 second as in the first example. Does this mean that you have suddenly become a faster runner? No. If we kept running to 300 yards, you would beat me by 3 seconds. But our relative abilities have not changed. This is where the importance of a valid beaten length correction comes in. In this example, it is simple. We would create a rating chart that says at a distance of 100 yards, 1 second at the finish equals 1 point. At a distance of 200 yards, 2 seconds would equal 1 point, and at 300 yards, 3 seconds equals 1 point, and so on and so on. We can now predict how much you would beat me by at any distance, assuming we both ran our best race. In this case, your best performance is always 1 point better than mine, though you beat me by a wider margin the further we run. This is how it works with horses, except for one complicating factor. They do not run at the same speed forever. They slow down the further they run, and so would we. Still, with Thorograph ratings, 1 point is equal to about 1 length at 5 furlongs, but 1 point is approximately 2 lengths at 10 furlongs, which is 1.25 miles. This magnifying effect is why longer races often appear to be total romps by the winner. The next factor is ground loss. Everyone knows that when a horse runs wide in the turns, he has to cover substantially more ground to reach the finish line than a horse that saves ground along the rail. Looked at another way, if horse A and horse B were at a dead heat, but in the running of the race horse B was 5 wide in the turn while horse A was on the rail, it is clear that horse B ran faster because he covered more ground in exactly the same amount of time. In fact, if they had both been on the rail, horse B would have beaten horse A by roughly 4 lengths at 6 furlongs. This is simple high school geometry, but gathering this data for every horse in every race is a lot of work. Thorograph's trackmen watch the videotape replays over and over until they are certain they have accurately recorded the position of every horse on every turn in every race. Each horse's performance rating is adjusted accordingly. Often this means that the winner of a race was not the horse that ran the fastest number. A perfect example of this was the 1991 Breeders' Cup Classic. Black Tie Affair beat Twilight Agenda by about a length. However, Black Tie Affair had gone to the lead early and was able to save ground on the rail on both turns, while Twilight Agenda was forced wide on both turns. Twilight Agenda actually ran about 4.5 lengths further than Black Tie Affair, but finished only 1 length behind. Consequently, he got a much better Thorograph rating in that race, even though he lost. Next, wind speed and direction. It is not difficult to imagine why this affects the final time of a race, but the mathematical formulas are quite complex. In 1981, we commissioned a meteorologist to study this and design an accurate formula that we then computerized and incorporated into all of our performance ratings. His study showed, and our analysis of thousands of races has confirmed, that the effect of an increase in the wind speed is geometrical. That is, if wind increases from 10 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour, the wind resistance doesn't just double, it quadruples. That is also why your car gets much worse gas mileage at 70 miles per hour than it does at 55 miles per hour. In a 1-mile race on a 1-mile oval, the wind has virtually no effect regardless of wind speed, because no matter how fast it is blowing or what direction it is coming from, at every point where the wind is pushing against the horses, there is a perfectly offsetting point directly across the track where the wind is helping them from behind. Obviously, some of the most dramatic wind effects on the final time are encountered in a race out of a long chute with a strong headwind against the horses straight down the backstretch. The wind will help them in a stretch run, but what is important to the final time is the difference in length between the combined distance of the backstretch and the chute versus the much shorter stretch run. It is a net difference that determines how much effect the wind has. A more subtle effect would be a crosswind blowing directly across the track. Here there is virtually no effect when the horses are on either the backstretch or stretch run, but there is a large effect on the turns. In a 2-turn race, the effect of the wind is negligible because the turns cancel each other out. But in a 1-turn race, the impact is considerable. If, for example, the wind is coming straight towards the grandstand, it pushes the horses from behind on the turn and speeds up the time of the race. We have compiled the exact length of the backstretch, the turns, and the chutes at every racetrack in North America, and our computer is programmed with the configuration for each race distance at each track and automatically makes the proper adjustments based on the wind data measured by our trackmen during the running of each race. The effect of weight carried is one of the most important yet least understood variables in handicapping. For this reason, we will discuss it in detail towards the end of the video. Suffice it to say now that if 2 horses both run 1 mile in 1:36 and one is carrying 12 more pounds than the other, that horse ran a much better race. To answer the question of how much better, we have studied tens of thousands of races to measure how much effect weight has, and it is much more than most people think. More on this later. Last and certainly not least is the track variance. As those of you who already use speed figures know, this is a quantitative evaluation of the track surface. A track is faster on some days than others depending on how the grounds crew has maintained it, or if it happened to rain the night before, or if the temperature has changed significantly from the previous day, or for many other reasons. These things change the speed of the track itself. If you have ever run along a beach, you have experienced this. You can run much faster on the wet sand than on the dry sand with the same amount of effort. The object of making a variant is to adjust the performance ratings of horses that run on different days under different conditions so that they are directly comparable, as if the horses had all run on the same track under the exact same conditions. Using the beach as an example again, if we time 10 people running 100 yards on the wet sand and they average 11 seconds, and the same 10 average 15 seconds on the dry sand, we would say the variant for the dry sand is -4 seconds. Once we know the speed of the two surfaces, we can use this knowledge to directly compare one person's effort on the dry surface with another person's effort on the wet one. This approximates what we do in crafting the track variance and Thorograph performance ratings. We look at all of the figures for each horse that ran on the day in question and compare statistically these figures with their past efforts and their current form cycles. This is a painstaking process completely different from the rough mechanical variance that simply compare winners' times to the historical track record at that distance. In fact, the true track variant frequently changes throughout the day, and Thorograph figures incorporate this as well. The most obvious cause would be rain showers throughout the day, but it could also be from rain the previous night. Even though the track is listed as fast and the weather clear, the track will have more moisture than normal in it and continues to dry out as the afternoon wears on. 6 furlongs and 1:11.4 in the 9th race can be completely different than 6 furlongs and 1:11.4 in the 1st or 2nd race. At Thorograph, we monitor overnight weather conditions at each racetrack. We once found that at certain tracks, the variance seemed to get slower and slower throughout the day without any weather changes to explain it. We contacted the groundskeeper and found out that they had changed to a maintenance routine of watering the track very heavily before the first race and then not at all during the program. The location was windy and the effect was simply the same as if it had rained the night before and the track was steadily drying out. Having synthesized all the above factors, time, wind speed, ground loss, weight, and track variant, into a single extremely accurate performance rating for each race of the horse's life, Thorograph is able to answer the first of the two important questions posed earlier, which was, how well has each horse performed in the past? Now we can move on to approach the second question, which, if you recall, was, how well will each horse run today? This is much more fun, but first we have to learn to decipher the information and layout of the Thorograph sheet. Let's start with the most important concept. The lower the number, the better the race. Generally, the range is from about 0 to 50, where 0 is a top effort by a champion such as Ali Sheba, and 50 is a poor effort by a 2-year-old claimer. Remember, the lower the number, the better the race. Next comes the placement of the numbers on the sheet. It may look haphazard to you at first, but it is really very simple and makes perfect sense. Look along the bottom of the sheet and notice that there are 4 major vertical columns. Each column represents a year in a horse's career: 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and 5-year-old. Each number in the far left column represents a race during Proudest Hour's 2-year-old year. This visual layout is maintained whether or not the horse races a 2-year-old. Had he not raced until he was a 4-year-old, the 2 left columns would be empty and his first race would appear in the 4-year-old column. If a horse is laid off for a year, the corresponding column will be blank. For older horses, a second sheet is added showing the years 6 through 9 in the same format, and you receive both sheets and you're set for that day. Now look at the far left border and note the months of the year running vertically. The year starts at the bottom of the sheet and progresses month by month to the top. If you look at July in the 2-year-old column, you will see 2 numbers, a 21 in mid-July, followed by a 16 1/4 in late July. We know it is a 16 1/4 because of the small superscript on the upper right of the number. The numbers are delineated in 1/4 increments. If you look up in September, there is a 19 with a small 2. This stands for 19 2/4 or 19 1/2. 19 3/4 could be indicated by either 19 1/2 or 20 minus. The 21 in mid-July has been annotated first start of career. This is indicated on the sheet itself by the double lines drawn directly underneath the number. It is also noted as having taken place on July 16th. How do we know that? By the horizontal lines that divide each month into 4 weeks, where the top of the number is placed indicates the date of the race. The top of the 21 is placed somewhat into the 3rd week of July, which would be about the 16th. The next race, the 16 1/4, would occur about the 28th of July, very near the end of the month. Next, look at November of the 2-year-old year. There is one race, a 22, which took place on approximately the 10th of the month. Once we reach the end of each year at the top of the sheet, we start reading again at the bottom, in the next column over, which is January of the next year. Hopefully you can gather from all this that a horse's most recent races are the ones nearest the top of the rightmost column. In Proudest Hour's case, this is a triple K, our symbol for broke down in late June of his 5-year-old year. Now to one of the most important aspects of Thorograph sheets. Within each year, the better or lower numbers are placed proportionally further to the left and the worse or higher numbers to the right. This allows us to see the form cycle at a glance. If the horse is steadily improving, the numbers themselves will be moving to the left. If he is deteriorating, the numbers will be drifting to the right. Look at Proudest Hour's first few races as a 2-year-old. First, the 21 is furthest to the right. Next, the 16 1/4, which is a better race, is over to the left of that. The 14, which is slightly better, is proportionally further left from the 16 1/4. You can see the horse's improvement visually. there is another 14 1/4 directly above the first 14, as it is only very slightly worse. And then comes a 19 1/2, which being worse is back off to the right again. Note that it is still not as far to the right as the earlier 21 or 22 up in November. One can also see visually that from the beginning of his career he has needed progressively more and more time off between races, just by the fact that the numbers themselves are getting further and further apart as you move up the page into his 3-year-old year. These types of patterns, which become apparent once you have some experience using Thorograph, can explain why a horse that won so easily last time out is off the board as a favorite next time against the same company. And it is the extreme accuracy of the numbers coupled with the ability to interpret these patterns which gives Thorograph handicappers an overwhelming advantage. We will discuss the basic patterns that tend to appear over and over again, but there is one more topic to cover under the heading of sheet reading, the various symbols and abbreviations used on the sheet besides the ratings themselves. These are all contained in the key that is included with each set of sheets. The most important symbols are mud dots, symbols for turf and Lasix, for claims, and for trouble encountered during the running. Where comments such as taken up, off poorly, stumbled, or dead rail appear next to a performance rating, the rating itself is not adjusted for these factors because these types of trip problems are not quantifiable. They are subjective. Off poorly might have a more negative impact on a front runner than on a closer. We can't know precisely how much being taken up on a turn affects a certain horse. These are judgments that each handicapper has to make for himself. Okay, we can finally get to handicapping. Let's look at some common patterns that become visible now that you are using accurate performance ratings. These patterns can be seen many times just over the course of one day's racing program if you look carefully. They are important to recognize, but it is important to understand why these patterns or form cycles exist at all. Stated simply, horses are not machines. They are not consistent. They cannot run every day because of the stress placed on their bodies from racing. It takes time to recover, and some recover faster and more completely than others, and differently at different stages of their careers. This leads us to this first, simplest, and most common pattern, what we call the bounce. When most horses run what for that individual horse is a very strong performance relative to his previous races, they are rarely able to come right back and exceed or even duplicate it next time out. They usually run worse. That is what we call the bounce. Let's examine the sheet of deposit ticket. Looking at his 3-year-old year, the bounces are very evident. In his first race as a 3-year-old, he ran a 9 1/4, the best race of his life so far. We call that running a top. He then bounced to a 14 1/4, then ran another top, followed by another bounce back to 14 1/2, then ran a new top, 8 1/2. This is, in fact, what we term an OXOX pattern. It is simply a series of tops or near tops, which we call O's, followed each time by a bounce, which we call X's. It is an easy pattern to handicap. We will use the O and X terminology in describing other patterns as well. Remember, O is a horse's peak performance, while X's are the bounces or the bad races. The OXOX pattern is most often seen in 2- and 3-year-olds, especially fillies. Fillies tend to bounce more often and more severely than colts. Here is another OXOX pattern. Starting with Till Forbid's first 3-year-old race, the 19 on March 10th, she alternated XO, 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 XO for about 8 races all the way into July. The pattern is more subtle because the bounces are not as obvious as in our previous example. A common question is, does it matter how far a horse bounces? Is an 11 followed by a 14 1/2 different than an 11 followed by a 24? The answer is yes. While bouncing is normal and healthy, a severe bounce or bounces can indicate that the top preceding them was a tremendous exertion for that horse and that it will take longer than usual for him to recover. If we look at the sheet for Big Sur, we see that in August he ran an 11 1/2 followed by a bounce to 24 1/4. That's a big bounce. He ran even worse than his earlier 18s, and look at what has happened since. Sometimes a horse just runs too fast for his own good and aggravates some physical shortcomings that takes time to heal or even ends his career entirely. When the bounces are slight, it is more likely that the horse is in top shape and ready to exceed his previous good efforts, or at least stop bouncing, as was the case with Till Forbid. Keep in mind that patterns don't last forever. They point the way to what is coming next. A healthy 3-year-old horse is still physically growing and gathering strength as the year progresses. If Till Forbid could run a 13 in early April and an 11 1/4 in early May, both followed by only slight bounces, it is normal that by August or September, 11s should be no problem at all. If she stays healthy, she should be able to run 8s or better in the very near future. The pattern of a healthy, growing horse exhibiting steady improvement as it gets older is a pattern we call forging. A couple of beautiful examples of forging are Star of Cosine and Sultry's Song. They just keep forging ahead. They may bounce, but they come right back to meet or exceed their best efforts in short order. Remember though, sooner or later even these horses will reach their ultimate physical peak and their patterns will change. Going back to Proudest Hour, we see that as a 3-year-old he ran 10.5 in early April, but his best in August is only 11.25, and in September is a 13. His tops are getting worse at an age where they should be getting better. If we were advising an owner or a trainer, we would suggest that a problem exists that may not have surfaced to the naked eye yet. It will be an excellent time and strongly recommended to sell Proudest Hour as soon as possible. One final caveat about bounces. Don't look for bounces from 2- and 3-year-olds who are lightly raced just because their last race was a good one. It may still not be a big effort for that horse. Let's look at Offbeat and Pleasant Stage. Even though their most recent races are tops, in neither case is there any evidence that these are going to be tops which will necessarily cause a bounce next time out. They could run just as well or better, and both did. We really need evidence of a previous bounce or topping pattern to establish each horse's ability or where they stand in their own form cycle. Let's look at another pattern, a pair of tops. This occurs when a horse is able to run a new top, then repeat the same performance next time out. This is a show of strength. To qualify as a pair, the tops must be run no longer than 3.5 weeks apart. There are good things to come from a horse that can pair, but there are distinctions to be made as to when they will come, which have to do with the horse's age and rate of development. Generally, the younger the horse, the sooner you can expect even better performances. A very healthy 2-year-old may pair a top, then immediately move forward to a new top next time out. Vivano, Bertrando, and Big Sur are examples. Notice how these horses all paired in their first few starts, then move forward in a big way. Knowing that most horses bounce from very strenuous performances, the running of a pair tells you that the first top of the pair didn't hurt that much. That means the horse can probably run even faster. Keep in mind these examples are of very strong 2-year-olds. 3- and 4-year-olds are not developing as quickly, and a pair, while still a show of strength, usually has some short-term consequences. They are more valid tops, and the problem is, if one top didn't make the horse bounce, 2 in a row probably will. This could be the case with weaker 2-year-olds as well. A textbook example of what to look for from a healthy 3- or 4-year-old after a pair is exhibited by Wilderness Song. In June and July she paired 11s, 11 and 11.5 are close enough, about 3 weeks apart. Take note of her 11 in June and her 11.5 as a 2-year-old. This is important for 2 reasons. A pair of tops have to be tops, not just good races, and it is essential that we see a 3-year-old match or better its 2-year-old top before we start looking at it as a developing horse. 3 weeks after the pair, Wilderness Song runs a 14.25. A slight bounce perfectly in line with her previous 3-year-old performances. You might say that this is the pause which refreshes. She is then able to forge ahead in the autumn to new tops. Another excellent example of a fit 3-year-old is Take Me Out. Look at the difference between his 2-year-old pair pattern and his 3-year-old pair pattern. As a 2-year-old, he paired 17s, moved immediately ahead to pair 13s, then ahead to an 11. But as a 3-year-old, he paired 9 3/4, then bounced to the 12 and took 5 weeks off before moving ahead to a new top, the 6 3/4. Less fit animals may take months or many races to come back to their top. Another pattern that we see, although less often, is a circle pattern. This occurs when a horse gradually moves in and out of form over the course of many races, and because of the design of the Thoro-Graph sheet, it appears as a visual curve in the placement of the numbers. Deposit Ticket's entire 2-year-old year is one big circle pattern, where a 22.25 into form, then right back out again to a 22.25. From a betting standpoint, you would rather see the opposite of this example, a horse rounding into form, which is underappreciated by the public because his last few races are not so good. An important caution, though. Once a circle pattern like this is completed, i.e. the horse has run his top again, he may be eligible for a big bounce. Just because a horse rounds into form does not mean he can keep moving forward indefinitely. The next pattern is important for 2 reasons. It occurs fairly often, and it can yield very good prices. It is what we call the O2X. Again, O's are peak performances, and X are poor performances or bounces. The O2X pattern exists when a horse runs a new top, the O, which is then followed by a performance about 2 points worse than the top, and then the next race after that is an X. This pattern is often followed by an immediate return to the top, or possibly even better than that. A good illustration of this pattern is PROVO. The 19 in mid-October is the O, followed by the 21, which is exactly 2 points worse, and then by the X, a 26. He came right back 2 weeks after the 26 with a 16. Remember that like other patterns, the younger the horse, the stronger the effort the pattern is likely to produce. A 3-year-old could be expected to return to its old top after the running of the X, while a 4 or 5-year-old can be expected to run well, but may not make it all the way back to his top. We have completed our look at some of the most obvious recurring patterns. Try to become familiar with them and look for them as your handicap, but keep in mind that to be successful, you need to analyze each horse as an individual, with its own distinct scenario, which is affected by other handicapping factors as well. These obviously can include a change of trainer or an equipment change or a layoff among countless others. You have to think about what causes each horse's particular patterns. What do you do if you don't see a specific pattern, which will often be the case? One useful approach is to compare the horse's recent good races to his previous good races and compare his recent bad races to his other bad races. The direction of his form should become apparent. When we looked at Proudest Hour, we pointed out that as a 3-year-old, his tops got progressively worse. 10 in May, 11 in August, 13 in October. But notice that his off races also deteriorated, from 15 minus in May to 17 and a half. And sure enough, it took him 8 months and a lot of time between starts to get back to his top. If a horse's good races are getting better, this is obviously good news. Obviously, if a horse's good races are deteriorating relative to his past good races and his X's are getting worse too, it is a horse to stay away from. Frequently, you will see that type of a horse going off as a favorite because they won last time out with a near-top effort. But you will know that they are going to bounce badly this time. Conversely, sometimes you can get a clue by seeing the X's improving even though the tops are maintaining the same level. This could be a horse about to go to a new top, and any time you can bet a horse to run better than it has ever done before, or it has done in a long time, you'll catch very long odds. Okay, there is something you need to know which we mentioned earlier, and that is how to analyze the effects of weight carried. An understanding of weight will improve your handicapping dramatically, and here is what you need to know to understand how weight affects Thorograph performance ratings. First, whatever weight each horse carried in his previous races is already accounted for in his Thorograph rating for that race. You never have to consider weight carried during previous races. You are not going to make any adjustments whatsoever to the past numbers you already have on the sheet. Therefore, if a horse is carrying more or less weight today than it did last time out, you do not need to make any adjustments either to the past ratings. Suppose there is a horse that always runs 14. It's been carrying 110 pounds. Today it is carrying 120 pounds. What will it run? It will run a 14. It will have a slower finishing time than when it carried 110 pounds, but it will still run a 14. That's what the horse runs. Thorograph adjusts today's performance figure so that the slower time is offset by the higher weight carried, which leads us to the important question: how much effect did that 10 pounds have? The answer is 2 full points. In research in tens of thousands of races, we found that 5 pounds is equal to 1 point. And remember, the 1 point is equal to about 1 length at 5 furlongs and 2 lengths at 1.25 miles. Now suppose that there is another horse in today's race that also always runs 14, but this horse is carrying his usual 110 pounds today. Let's say that this is a 1.25 mile race. Which horse would you bet? And how will they finish? They are both going to run 14s, but one is carrying 10 pounds more than the other. This is when you have to use weight. You have to make the mental adjustment when looking at the entries for today's race. Although you know that both horses will run 14, one will have the equivalent of a 2-point advantage at the finish because it is carrying 10 pounds less weight in this particular race. It will beat the other horse by 4 lengths at 1.25 miles. In fact, he could actually afford to run, say, a 15 and a half. He would still win by a margin of 0.5 point, which is 1 length at 1.25 miles, even though he ran a worse number than the other. This is very similar to the case of ground loss, which we discussed earlier. The horse that runs the fastest number doesn't always win. Sometimes you can bet a horse that is substantially slower than the rest of the contenders, but is carrying 10 or 12 pounds less weight, and is situated where he will save ground throughout. In this case, a horse could run a 13 and easily beat other horses that run 10s and 11s. Remember, when assessing weights, the only thing that matters is to compare today's weights with each other. If they are all carrying the same weight, there is nothing to think about. If one happens to have a 7-pound apprentice allowance, then you have to make a mental adjustment, giving that horse about a 1.5 point advantage. His 15 and a half today is actually worth all the other horses' 14s. For those of you out there that are owners or trainers, you may already see how Thorograph can be used to strengthen your program by helping you determine accurately the ability of your horses and that of the competition. Thorograph not only supplies data to the industry, but has long acted as a consultant, and we have had great success advising on claims and private purchases. Since we evaluate ability as opposed to accomplishment, we are often able to find horses with stakes ability who have not yet run in stakes and are therefore not yet expensive. Such was the case with Try for Size, who was running an allowance race in Florida. We recommended his purchase, and he won the Grade 1 Sword Dancer at Belmont for our client. This ability to compare horses in different areas also led us to the bargain purchase of Sunny Blossom, who had been racing in Canada, and soon after set the 6-furlong track record at Santa Anita for client Marty Bauer. It also led us to Claramount, who we brought from California to New York, where he won 2 graded stakes, and to Admiralis, who went from Maryland to California with the same result. As we have seen, the pattern of a horse's past figures give Thorograph experts the ability to make judgments about his future. And in the case of Excellent Tipper, the Lone Ranger, and even Chris, we had our clients buy them because they looked like they were heading in the right direction. All 3 developed into graded stakes horses as 3-year-olds. If you have questions about how Thorograph can help your program, or about anything else on this tape, just give us a call at our toll-free number. You should now be ready to head out to the track and start using Thorograph performance ratings. We recommend that you begin carefully, since it will take some practice before you are really skilled with them. We look forward to hearing about your success.